pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth therein, and man was the lord of the sea. He controlled the vigorous steam. He harnessed the lightning for hire. He drove the celestial team, and man was the lord of the fire. Speak now from their throne.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Alan Averill. Greetings from the bunker at the end of the world. This is episode 24 of Agitators Anonymous. And I greet you all. It has been a while since we have heard from Victor in a state of Frankenstein in a tractor factory. But today is very glorious, very great day. Very great day for him because he is able to do some translations for the Irish state, Irish government. Because, let's be honest, living in Dublin right now is pretty much like living in a satellite Soviet state from 1987 or a satellite Soviet city. So, in the great tradition of BuzzFeed, what I'm going to do is to give you the 12 new statutes of the state of Dublin, which will be for your interpretation and your obedience. Yes, I thank you. Because this is kind of where we are right now. So my good friend and alter ego Victor will now read to you the 12 new statutes, as I said, in honour of the BuzzFeed Republic of Ireland, that you must all obey and toe the line to. Number 1. Komendantskie czas Svachetit Rozjechov, which roughly translates in Dublin as 11 p.m. curfew. Thank you very much, buddy. Number 2. Na ulice Bodit Palincia, which roughly translates into Dublinese as the guards are bleeding everywhere. Number 3. Stabeketochadu Stoichefochretium. Number 3 basically means I hope you like a bit of queuing, because you're going to be queuing for stuff. Number 4. Zubiskenobra Kedetrenu. Number 4 basically means you can't travel outside the state. We'll put 4 countries on your green corridor, but only one of them you can actually fly into, but we'd rather you didn't. Number 5. Zabrechenoi Krit Koviat Stretsva Masovoi Informacji. Number 5 roughly translates as, will you bleeding believe what the media tell you, will you? Stop asking questions. Or, as my Russian friend would put it, there will be no dissent from the mainstream narrative. Number 6. Vajmojshet obsheta Sjatolka Stiami Skiemai Razreshem. Number 6 roughly translate is, listen, you can only hang out with who we tell you can hang out with. Have you got that? Stay in your bleeding bubble. Number 7. Goso startso bjishit vashdonje vozraitiem. Number 7, which literally translates as, do you want your bleeding dole cut, do you? The state now controls your income. Number 8. Eskustfia tulke on brenjain goshodartsvom. Number 8. Art. What the fuck is art? What are you talking about, art? There is no art allowed that is not sanctioned by the state, my friends. And the sooner you realise that, the sooner the better. Number 9. Neka koi moi shashem transfiev teatra I kiamiedi. Number 9 roughly translates as there will be no music, no dancing, no gigs, no theatre or comedy allowed. Them are the rules of the state of Dublinistan. Number 10 is important. Sab seitja noroish etielkach vlestium. Number 10 is quite important. It basically means we encourage the public to inform on each other at any times possible. If you see anybody having the crack, you better tell on them. Number 11. Niet nikajki prestetjev anya neshtietje neshtashne prayat. Number 11. There are no protests. What are you talking about? There was never that many people there at all. Jesus. There's no protests. Nothing to see here. Number 12. Rabotiet chadoma nebyake dichia. And finally, folks, number 12 is quite important. We encourage you to work from home, and if you could, maybe you'd just stay there. Stay inside. Sure, what's the point in going outside anyway? Grand. There's the 12-point plan for Dublin moving ahead. So, any questions, you must inform your local Politburo if you have a question. Yes, indeed. So, I'm officially now a satirist. I'm available for any talk shows, any radio shows, if the RTE or the state would like to employ me, I am available. Yes, okay. So that was my attempt at satire, and I would like to thank my good friend Natasha for the translations, so Victor can speak properly to his people. But in all seriousness, while that did amuse me for a brief moment, there is some serious intent behind my piss taking, and that is literally that it would seem that Dublin, the county of Dublin, is under the most strict lockdown in the whole of Europe. Speaking to people from other countries across Europe, other cities, they find it quite shocking where we are. And so this podcast is going to be a little bit of a ramble across those muddy fields to try and reach some form of not a conclusion, because I don't think there is one, but I'm just going to ramble through a couple of opinions about things, a few views on what's going on. But the fact is that right now we have an 11 p.m. curfew. There's no pubs or restaurants open, so you can't sit inside. You can't even go inside to have a coffee. There is no gigs, no music, no theatre, no dancing, no comedy, no art, really, of any sort allowed. The state is encouraging people to inform on each other. We have a green corridor of travel of 4 countries, 2 of which I think are Gibraltar and Liechtenstein or something. 3 of the 4 countries you can't even fly into. And, of course, the mainstream media, for whatever it's worth, and I don't like using that pejorative because it suggests that nothing that they write is of any worth or on the money, and this is not true. But there most definitely doesn't seem to be much dissent or many probing questions of the state. In truth, having spent most of the week looking back at documentaries about other historical precedent, oddly enough, this is the 175th year of the anniversary of the famine in Ireland, and I've been looking into a few of the reasons, let's call them English political reasons between 1845 and 1849, things I didn't know. Like, for example, the influence of the peelers, or the problems within the English political establishment as the years between 1845 and 1849, and how relief was hamstrung by a run on gold and etc., etc. Maybe I shouldn't have diverged off into that lay-by quite yet. However, what I was trying to say, or what I'm trying to get at, is that right now in Ireland we have almost like a timeshare government who historically hate each other, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. They both come from the same origin, the same original party, and then they split off. There was a schism in the 1920s. And they hate each other. And it's quite clear that one is setting the other up to fall to the detriment of the civil liberties of the Irish people. And so right now we have Fianna Fáil in charge. And to say, I think I tried to explain this in a podcast before, the concept of the cute whore, H-O-O-R. You might want to go back and listen to one or two podcasts ago to hear me try and explain what that means. But that seems to be one of the things that is very prevalent at the moment in Irish society, is we are being hamstrung by a government that relies on the left hand hates the right hand, but they need each other for the majority. And so we're going round in this cycle of political cowardice. And the truth is, like I said, that Dublin is the most locked down, as I can see it, city in the whole of Europe, which I would have understood if this was 1972 or 1985 and Charlie Haughey was still in charge and, you know, was busy telling us to tighten our belts and all that kind of thing. There's an Irish reference for people of a certain age. But if it was 1986 and that was the reference, which of course Ireland lived through, you know, the 1980s was a time of great poverty and emigration. People fled the country in their tens of thousands. We sent our brightest, our best and our young hopes for the future with their education out into the world because Ireland couldn't provide for those people. And I do wonder where, once the dust has, well, settled, or we just have to learn how to breathe it in from this situation that we're in, where those people are going to go, because I don't think they're going to have anywhere to go. That's a different story. However, if this was 1986 and Charlie Haughey was still at the helm, I would have expected this. But what does that mean? Does that mean our political status, our political institutions haven't changed since the 1980s? They're still as incompetent as they were? Maybe so. I read an article during the week which basically said that art is seen as a luxury in Ireland, not a necessity. In other cities and across Europe, there's an attempt to open artistic spaces back up to the public because it's seen as something that's vital to the not only the mental well-being but the welfare of the people of the state. And it's the state that is supporting those ventures, whether it's a movement towards open-air theatre in Berlin or gigs being allowed in with some temperance across Europe. Here, and people are really surprised when I say this, absolutely nothing. Everything remains shut. Dublin is, as I said, is literally like a satellite Soviet state in 1987. And for all those kids marching under a hammer and sickle around the world looking to try and overthrow the current political structure, just send me an email. I'll tell you what it's like to live in a communist state. It's very, very boring. It's very, very boring. I digress. I bitch, and I try and do a little bit of, I attempt satire for the first time, shall we say. Is it the first time? I don't know. I will say this, though, that the protests in Ireland are starting to get bigger and bigger. What was first maybe portrayed as 1,000 or 2,000 people now the optics look much more like 15 or 20 or 25,000. But I had the same discussions with friends who are, there's something very strange happening, which is that when it suits Irish people, they lean into a romantic notion of us as rebels, a romantic notion of Irish people as resisting authoritarianism. It's somehow romantically linked to our psyche. But yet at the same time, the people who are worried about that are unwilling to stand beside people in a greater gathering against something like, or at least to question what's happening, because it's still being portrayed. And at least I had the arguments in the last week or two, people saying to me, it's the anti-hygiene protests. The anti-hygiene protests. Why don't we call it the civil liberty protests instead? But I understand that that's too much of an existential threat for most people to be able to fully grasp and get their heads around, because people are busy. They've got kids to bring up, they've got school runs to try and organize. And as I said to one of my friends, I said, I'm not looking for 100% of your critical faculties, or to allow your brain to shuffle along to the same dark recesses that I spend most of the time inhabiting. I'm not asking you to do that, but I would like, maybe, could it be possible to have 10% of your critical attention to maybe wonder about some of the actions of the state, to maybe take 10%, just a moment, to wonder, are these protests really about face masks, for example? It would seem to me that the face mask is just a totem, a tokenistic symbol when it comes to these debates. And it's used in order to not fully intellectually engage with what's happening. So therefore one side can dismiss it and the other side can dismiss it. Now, I have to admit that it would be very helpful if somebody could perhaps curate some of the banners that people are marching under in the Irish protests. If they gave me, like a small reference, I could stand at the behest of this gathering and go, guys, you gotta lose the QAnon and 5G banners, because what's clear is that normal people, even if they have and share concerns with some of the protests, they don't want to be standing beside somebody with a sign that says, connecting everyone to some sort of massive paedophile conspiracy. They just aren't going to stand beside those people. Which, of course, is ironic, coming from a country which literally handed over its own children to the Catholic Church for 150 or so years. But maybe that's a podcast for another day. We did have an article in the Irish Times, an article talking about the rise of the far right in Ireland. Now, maybe these are murky waters to wade into, but there's a few things to be said and understood about Irish nationalism and Irish patriotism, so to speak. And that is that Irish nationalism is left-wing. The IRA are, or the only political party in Ireland to, at the moment, be saying, open things up, give people back some of their freedoms and treat them responsibly, is Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin historically was the political side of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. And they were left-wing. There is a lot of Marxist theory underpinning their socialist view of the world. So when you see people on the streets waving Irish flags, you will see Socialist Workers' Party. It's not a symbol of the far right, as this article in the Irish Times was trying to suggest. I think there's an attempt to link it there, of course, to Trump and things happening in America. And there are elements, there is an inheritance of some curious religious right-wing movements from the 80s and the 90s, Opus Dei and these kind of people who were briefly popular in Ireland in the late 80s, early 90s, who mainly ran on anti-abortion platforms. But to suggest they're politically far right, I think is incorrect. I think they're more maybe religious, traditional Catholic values, traditional 1950s Irish style values. But again, it's an attempt to muddy the waters without really reporting on the nature of the protests in Ireland. Because the truth is that you will see more Celtic football t-shirts than anything else. So, I mean, are we going to blame Celtic Football Club for, instigating a great percentage of the people who are out there protesting? I think not. This is not to say, of course, there are not people of every political persuasion who are protesting against civil liberties. Because here, if we think of politics as a horseshoe, so to say, there's a moment where the left and the right meet around the end of that horseshoe. And on issues like civil liberties and issues like personal freedoms, I think that if people could stop the flag waving and the chest beating and the histrionics and the hysterical polarization, they would probably see that the reality is they're center left, center right, or in the center, actually, but that many of the people have the same concerns, the same worries. And as I said at the beginning of this, and I said 2 podcasts ago when I did the Smarmy I Told Just So headline, it was that, do we really expect our everything to be handed back exactly as we left it to the state? I think that was a pretty naive consideration, because we've handed it over to a political level of political cronyism that is bent on, of course, re-election. They're involved in the re-election cycle. In Ireland, we have this phrase parish pump politics, which means that the local politics is what dominates the Irish political landscape, which means that you can go and have a pint with your local TD in a pub, and, you know, brown envelopes were slipped from one pocket to another over the decades. And we have how can I explain? We have very great access to our politicians in Ireland, and that's what leads to a level of cronyism, a level of parochialism to Irish society, to Irish politics. So right now I think we're stuck in a cycle of parochial re-election, of a level of cronyism and cowardice, where no adult in the room is willing to say, look, okay, we understand the severity of the situation, but we are going to try and trust you and open society back up for the greater good. But together we have to place some trust in each other. I haven't really heard that from anyone in the room. All we get, I think, is the willingness to kick the can down the road continuously in the hope that either a vaccine appears out of nowhere, but I mean, what? Do we have any... we don't know that that's going to happen for sure. We don't know. But when you have, as I said, the 2 tenants of this timeshare apartment living in such close quarters to each other, who traditionally hate each other and are trying to scupper each other's ship, to hole each other's ship, so to speak. That sounds a bit rude, doesn't it? It's hardly surprising that there's this level of adolescent one-upmanship and sniping that's going on below decks. I'm still keeping with that nautical theme. Yes, indeed, matron. Has anybody seen Seaman Staines? Perhaps he's below deck. What am I talking about now? Maybe you can tell I'm a little bit deranged this week. I'm a little bit manic, a little bit angry. I have to admit that even though, as I said, I told you so, it still doesn't make some of these regulations and seem even... It still doesn't make them any easier to deal with. So, you know, what could I do but go and ask my friend Natasha for some Russian translations, so I can, do my best to try and make fun of situation. Also, I would appeal to the people of Liechtenstein who are on our Green Corridor list. If you would like me to abdicate and become your new king, monarch, ruler, just let me know. Just DM me on Instagram. I'm quite willing to abdicate the throne here in Ireland, in Dublin, and come over and become your new ruler. If you would like that, I have some great plans for the coming century, and I think that we could really, really have a solid relationship together. Well, you've got till the weekend, because I imagine next week's Green Corridor will be something completely different. Maybe it could be the Principality of Monaco, or another tiny feudal state, Andorra perhaps, we can travel freely to. So I appeal to any tiny medieval city-state in the world that somehow still exists, that needs a new ruler. Just get in touch. I have free time. I can draw up a new constitution for you. No problem. Anyway, what else am I talking about? Now, there is one other thing. I keep saying one other thing. One of the few things that's been keeping me sane throughout all of this strange situation is playing football. And oddly enough, the evening before beginning to make this podcast, I was playing football with a bunch of Russian guys and Ukrainian guys. And it was really interesting to get their take on what's happening here. And they found my pidgin Russian quite amusing. They were listening with kind of a childlike glee at my ridiculous attempts at talking Russian and the reasons for which I'm doing it. But, once we started talking, we were standing around, they did sort of say to me that even they were quite shocked at what was happening in Ireland. One of them had just come back from Moscow, and he still couldn't believe that the state was leaving theatre and comedy and art and everything else, almost the entire sector, to just die on the vine. And he made a joke, because he's about the same age as me. He said, "Yeah, even in old days, we had theatre. We had good, some good classical music and stuff." He was being flippant in his late 40s, I guess, mid 40s maybe, or perhaps I've put years on him there. But his point was that even in those days, now of course I understand that my false equivalency of comparing a couple of weeks or months of lockdown is not quite the same. You understand to not quite take everything I'm saying entirely seriously. But there is some serious intent behind some of it. But the guys, they stood around, they were telling me, I was asking where they came from and how things are back there. And one of the guys had just come back from Kiev in the Ukraine. And he just said to me, he said, "Man, nobody's observing any of these rules. There's vague rules and regulations, but the people are in no humour to deal with them. They're in no humour to toe the line with these. Don't forget, they only just had, they had their own conflict there only a couple of years ago. And there's certainly no way that the people are just going to be told to stay inside and told to toe the line for this, that and the other." And I said, "How are the deaths? How are things being reported?" And he said, "We have just under 4,000 is what he said. Now, of course, somebody can go and check that up. But for a population of 42 million, that represents pretty good odds, it would seem." And he just said, "No, there's no distancing. There's no masks. People are just living their lives." And at least here in the, culturally American hegemonic 53rd state, we never hear about how other countries are doing like this, or how other countries, unfashionable countries, are doing. How is Romania doing, or Hungary, or Bulgaria, or for example, the Ukraine? How are they dealing with this? And it would seem that by and large, they're dealing with it better than we are. And how come you never hear about any of this within our mainstream media narrative? I understand that probably, obviously, the devil is local, and the devil is in the local detail. So therefore, you can see why it has less resonance. But at the same time, for something so all important, it is a bit curious. But he just told me, and I think that this is true, is that especially in Eastern Europe, there's an old saying which is the West never forgets, or the East never forgets, the West never remembers. And those countries in Eastern Europe are far less likely to hand over civil liberties and freedoms to their state, because they've only had them back, realistically, for 20 or 25 years. So there's generations of people there who remember what it was like to live behind the Iron Curtain, and they aren't going to just hand over all of these freedoms to their states. And anecdotally, just talking to these half a dozen guys, they were quite shocked, quite confused by the level of subservience of Irish people, quite shocked at the lack of mainstream opposing narrative, and it just made me think. It did make me think twice about butchering their language in my podcast, but food for some kind of thought, I suppose. There is one thing that I was going to talk about briefly, which is the nature of journalism. Just to change tack a little bit, and I actually have a degree in journalism. I did it maybe 15 years ago at this stage, and it's interesting to observe that 15 years ago, as a mature student even then, that how unpoliticized the young people were that I went to college with. They were 18 to 19, and to be honest, the soap opera society had more people in it than the politics societies. There was almost a complete level of disinterest in politics, which now, speaking to my 18 or 19-year-old relatives who, well, they should have been starting college now, or maybe are in their second year of college and have had that second year snatched from them because everything is on Zoom, which is no way to be a student. And they wonder why students are not coping so well with some of these measures, when you're supposed to be living this time of your young life. Anyway, God, I sound like such a middle-aged academic. Yes. Anyway, no, what I'm trying to say is that an awful lot has changed. As I have alluded to before over several of the podcasts, that how can we say, that we are in, I think, a decade of social media derangement is the politest way of putting it. We have become deranged by social media, and we're in some sort of brave new world on those terms. And 15 years ago in journalism, very few of the students that I at least went to college with, and it was 50, 60 people, were remotely politicized. And the thing about it is that, and it's one of the reasons why we get very little investigative journalism anymore, or we get very little or non-partisan journalism anymore, is because the bottom line is that you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, which basically means that there is no living to be made in writing anymore, in journalism. And therefore, on those terms, the supplementary income is your idealism. So over the last 10 years, many young people have become radicalized, so to say, or polarized at the very least into identity politics or into one side or the other. And the payoff for not being paid is that you get to have moved your opinion blog onto the broadsheets. So you see articles, even in the Irish Times or in the Irish mainstream media, they're not really investigative. They're not really even asking questions of the mainstream narrative. They're towing the line to the mainstream narrative based on their own assumption of identity politics, for example. The assertion that people marching and protesting in the streets in Ireland, simply because they're holding some of the same signs as people who have been marching in the USA, is enough. There's the link, i.e. orange man bad, orange man bad, and therefore the people marching in the streets who hold up signs with one thing or the other on it, if you see the same things in Ireland, you connect those two things. What am I trying to say? That was a bit confused. My point was that, again, with something like journalism, there is no living to be made in it anymore. Very much like a musician. There's very little of a living to be made for it anymore unless you go on tour. So there's very little money to be made as an investigative or non-partisan journalist anymore. And the supplementary benefit, as I said, is by getting your ideals out there. So you don't really need to go down and speak to people at the protests, for example, in Ireland. You don't really even need to go down and take too much of a look at them. You can make assumptions based on a few optics or a few of the people who have YouTube channels who you see supporting them and that kind of thing. You don't really need to go down and talk to any of the Joe Publics and ask them their opinion about, for example, civil liberty or freedom or any of those things. You can make broad assumptions because it fits into your idealistic view of the world and what you wish to portray. And I think that this is one of the biggest problems that we're having now with free speech, because there's a whole generation of people for whom the concept of free speech seems to be something that they see as a bit somewhat of a nuisance, that somebody would want to support the idea of free speech. And that is because the crusade of activism, let's call it the crusade for justice, is more important than the concept of civil liberty or personal liberty. At least that's how I see it. And I had to stand up rows about these columns, these articles with people that I know. And I said to them, did you go down and have a look at any of the protests? No. But trying to separate people from these polarized opinions is almost impossible, because what you do realize, and this is a phrase I was thinking about earlier in the week, is that nuance is surrender. Is that neither side wants to consider a nuanced argument, or the fact that human beings are nuanced, or that some opinions I have you might agree with, some you might disagree with. That's not the point. If the point is winning, is crusading, is whatever else you want to call it. And so nuance is surrender. And that's just to let that concept sink in for a moment. So trying to suggest to people that, and then you mix that understanding. You mix that understanding with the fact that our news cycle is driven by an algorithm. It's driven by a marketing algorithm. I've bored people before by saying this in the podcast, but all of the isms, all of the phobias, they're what drive clicks. Reasoned debate, as I said before, rational woman says reasonable thing, doesn't get any clicks. It doesn't get any traction. And because all of your news media is driven by the same marketing algorithm, it needs clicks. So therefore, all of the salacious, grubby, dirty stuff rises to the top because it has to, because that's actually what people are interested in. So all of these articles are just written to order. I mean, I'm sure the Irish Times saw a big spike in relation to an article with the tagline Ireland and the far right or whatever, because these are the kind of details that drive clicks now. So if we marry those things, we marry our understanding that that what we are living through is something of a religious revival is quite complicated sometimes. Because in reality, when you argue with the religious or people with faith, you never get through to them in the sense that they don't listen to, objective reason on those terms, because they've invested so much time into that article of faith. And so your objective reason is just never going to live up to that. And the natural human instinct is to double down when your beliefs are threatened. You're not going to get anywhere with somebody who, believes that, the earth was created 4,000 years ago. Or somebody who believes even that the earth is flat. Especially not if they are found their fellow religious acolytes online. And also, it's like doing the lottery every single day. The chances of you winning the lottery are so few and far between, so remote, that it really represents a pointless task. But if you invest a small amount of money and effort and time, and you walk to the shop every single day, and you've been doing it for months, you always hold on to the small belief that this could be the day, this could be the ticket, this could be it. And to just quit one day and go cold turkey and go, well, I'm never going to win the lottery, that's the end of that, and just move on to something else with your life if it's what's mentally obsessed and possessed you for such a long time. Now, obviously, the lottery is a rather banal and mundane example if you're talking about the afterlife or the rewards of the afterlife. But if the rewards of identity politics or the rewards of modern politicking or activism are changing the world, and you feel that you're part of an actual movement that could change the world, as opposed to, well, whatever else emptiness that you're trying to deal with, existential emptiness on many levels, then you can see how it becomes a religious crusade. And on those terms, I think it's one of the problems that many people, and including myself, have. Many people who try and use, or at least I think I try and use, relatively reasonable debate, or try and imagine the rational, observational, point-to-point view of things, is that it doesn't really matter, because that's not what the game is. The game is winning. The game is my God is greater than your God. My faith is greater than your atheism, so to speak. So when you try and rationally interject any of these things into into a debate, you're not going to win, as I see it. And that's one of the great problems that we're facing right now in this 10-year derangement cycle via social media, is that things that were once shared reality, shared beliefs, shared structures, whether they could be science, are now open to question and interpretation. And they're all falling apart because the new moral code is based on a subjective view of reality. Anyway, pay peanuts, get monkeys. It's a pretty relevant phrase that I think you can apply to most things. Like I said, you can apply it to the music industry. You can apply it to filmmaking. You can apply it to being an author of any kind. But specifically in journalism, it creates, or has created, quite the vacuum, as I said, in that it being so difficult to make a living, that old school journalists or investigative journalists or non-partisan journalists just don't really, they vacated the building, leaving the space to activism. Anyway, what am I talking about? Should we talk about some heavy metal, or should I talk about the American presidential debate? Well, maybe some heavy metal next time. But what a sorry state American politics is in, if that's what we were served up the other night. It's like watching the final phase, or like the second final act of a really awful horror film. I really didn't know quite what to think about it. I mean, of course, like I said many times before, I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band. If you've subscribed to the podcast, then you probably know that I'm going to talk about the odd thing like this here and there. But what a strange and sorry sight it was to witness this debate. Prior to it, I'd gone back and watched a really great documentary series by the comedian Rich Hall about the American presidential history and the debates through the years, and Lyndon B. Johnson and, Goldwater, and went through Watergate and Nixon and, Reagan and, well, amongst dozens and dozens of names, Adams and Jefferson and all these kind of people, and their history and their strange relationships with the Parliament of the time, even going back and looking at the American Constitution. And of course, Rich Hall is a very funny and accomplished comedian who has a very interesting sideways take on all of it. But a little prepping for the election debate, I thought, well, what else am I doing? Let's wade into this. Let's go back and look at what the Constitution was, what it represents, how it was supposed to be interpreted. And it's quite an amazing document, how short it is, its brevity, and it's sort of very matter of fact and also yet open to interpretation, succinctness. Quite an amazing document, so to speak. But the relationships between the presidents and their I suppose opposing counterparts throughout the years. It went through all the dirty tricks and scandals and all the incredible ads, TV ads that were back in the day. Things that would, I suppose, in our modern context, looking at the shit show that's on display right now, you think that all the dirty tricks are, somehow you think they're new propaganda, but they're not. Looking back at some of the dirty tricks in some of the old presidential campaigns was quite revealing. And of course, things like Watergate and Nixon and that kind of thing. But it still didn't quite prepare me for the almost numbing banality of the debate the other day. If you were to ask my opinion about it, I thought Biden didn't seem as decrepit as people had been making out. He didn't seem as ready for the grave as many people had been saying. So I suppose on those terms, the fact that he didn't get flustered or put off his stride much speaks maybe more to his mental state than people have been giving him credit. Well, as for Trump, Trump is Trump. It's, again, the horror show of having a vaudeville circus entertainer as your president, especially at a time like this, in a situation where the world needs some steady hands on the tiller. To have this horror show playing out is only amplifies the craziness of the situation. You're probably sitting there thinking, or standing, or whatever you're doing, thinking, oh God, do we really need political commentary from you, Avril? Well, look, if I'm going to be doing this for the next 5 or 10 years, like I said, if this is the fat Elvis last Vegas stand of my career, well, then I might as well find a hill to go and eat myself to death on. I suppose this might as well be it. This is the last days. So I might as well throw out a little bit of social commentary, a little bit of political commentary. But speaking to lots of my friends in America, they are really, really worried about where everything is heading. And I think that you can link all of this to, as I have already mentioned before, the decade of social media derangement. We are at the end of that decade, and I think that it's almost impossible for anybody to somehow climb back from the precipice or to see reason when everything is so polarized. Regardless of that, it was just quite a fascinating and somewhat morbid curio of a presidential debate. I think a great part of it is the fact that once upon a time we had something of a shared reality as people. We had some shared and common narratives. And back, for example, in the 80s, we had the two great superpowers lined up against each other, and you sort of knew where you stood in the world. And the old, I suppose, cliche of the family gathering round the news that evening. This was a moment of shared reality. We had our shared inheritance, our shared history. We had more, how shall we say, commonplace reality, which made it much easier to see that we were standing on the same ground. Whereas now, I think after 10 years of being digitally curated, we're almost in a chess match with the algorithm, the internal algorithm. And once upon a time, the machine that challenged Garry Kasparov couldn't beat him, but now it can. And we are living under this almost ridiculous assumption that we might be able to somehow outmaneuver the algorithm. Whether it's curating your every whim and need, it's keeping you on the platforms, it's keeping your attention, the attention economy, whatever you want to call it. We still somehow think that we can come out on top, but the fact is we can't. And every single one of us has our own personally curated reality. And this is one of the things that we're falling apart on as a society, is that we no longer have shared realities. We no longer have shared dreams, shared views of history. We no longer have even shared ideas of science or gender or all sorts of things. And every single person, by being connected to their phone, their platforms throughout the day, is feeding this algorithm, this machine. And the idea that this machine is designed in a benign way in order to help you as a human being is, again, a misnomer, because that's entirely not what it's supposed to do. We're all living in basically an episode of our own Truman Show. I mean, perhaps we need to see modern advertising almost as a living organism of some description. No, that's a bit too much, really, isn't it? But we think that this is a chess match that we can ultimately win. And what it's doing is it's breaking down reality. This is, I think, one of the problems that we're having now. Destroyed our element of civility. And how can I put it? I mean, I'm going to butcher this, but let me try and sort of frame it before I disappear and we head off into the sunset. But if you think about us as human beings, we have our hunter-gatherer instincts with a 2,000-year-old morality, dealing with a medieval banking system and a 100, 200-year-old political system, but yet dealing with all of those things with a modern social media barrage of information that we never had to deal with before. And all of these things, these 20th century notions of sexual liberty, they're all butting up against this 21st century technology. And I don't think we really stand a chance on those terms. How could we make sense of all of this? I certainly couldn't make sense of the American presidential election debate. I'm wondering how on earth we got to that place. Now, of course, people will say to me, oh, it's all a plot and all a plan and it's all been predestined and it's all part of some great Machiavellian globalist plot. And I think to myself, really, is Trump part of that? Was he placed in The Apprentice and then Twitter then installed him as the arch fiend, the crown prince of hell itself, the king of tweets? Was this all planned? It just seems all an crazy, chaotic, unlikely mess. And here we are, we're about to live through the final, the end of a decade of social media derangement. So normally I make a few notes before I start off on a podcast, and I ramble and I go all over the place and here and there and the other. And, on this page that I'm looking at right now, I was going to finish with a story about how I almost got in a fight with the glam rock band Tiger Tails in London a long time ago. But that seems to have been forgotten as I got sidetracked into waffling about the American presidential election debate. Now, if 15 minutes ago I'd held some kind of a vote about which you'd rather I talk about. Would you rather I talk about, on the one hand, the American presidential election debate, on the other, getting in a fight with a Welsh glam rock band? Well, out of my mind. You probably would have picked, Alan, tell us about that time where you nearly had your head kicked in by grown men wearing high heels. My bad, really my bad. I should have started off probably with the Tiger Tail story off the top of the podcast rather than doing my Victor voice. Maybe I could have married the pair of them. Well, anyway, it is what it is. So, apologies to all anybody Russian who's gotten this far in the podcast. Apologies for butchering your language. It was mainly for comedic effect. You do understand that we have to do what we can to try and keep sane. And I mean, obviously, 20th century communism and living under communism was such a hilarious time in the human race that, why shouldn't I make a little fun of it, huh? Got to find the silver lining in every cloud, huh? I should have mentioned, of course, the podcast sponsors, Hate Couture, off the top of the podcast, but it's a bit late now. www.hatecouture616.com, COUTURE, hateful yet tasteful apparel. I'll be posting a few things on Instagram about them in the coming week or two, so that might be a bit better to check out. And I hope you got a little chuckle out of that, perhaps something like this. So apologies for that. You can give out to me if we ever make it back to Russia. And you can tell Edward Snowden, you can tell him he can feel free to use my 12-point plan if he needs to. As usual, I've left all of the socials onto the last moment. So I will say it is Instagram, Nemthiang_Primordial. Patreon is patreon.com/Alan Averill, 2 capital A's. And that's about it. It's a rambling all over the place podcast. And I have a few interesting ones coming up now where I've decided to post some of my videos or my photos along with some of the travels that I've taken. So I'm going to do 3 podcasts about Easter Island, Angkor Wat and Chernobyl, 3 places I visited and took loads of videos and interesting pictures. And so maybe I would advise going over and subscribing to my YouTube channel. Anyway, my friends, as I said, somewhere in the middle of all that, don't take me quite that seriously. This is Alan Averill, and this is Agitators Anonymous, the end of episode 24. Metal never bends.